I'd firstly like to welcome you all here and to thank you for coming, and to thank you for your support to climate action and to the United Nations Environment Programme. I'd like to thank our team for working so hard to put this event together, and UNEP for their ongoing partnership. I'd also like to thank our partners for their advice and support. That's the World Green Building Council, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and UNEP Sustainable Building and Climate Initiative. I'd also like to thank very much our sponsors, Nedbank, Scania, who are providing the buses, MTN, New Holland, Suzlon, Schneider Electric, and Ingeo. Having met with the speakers earlier this week, I'm looking forward to a very lively and informative debate here on sustainable cities. And once the debate is over, there'll be cocktails with the Prince and Princess of Monaco, as well as Achim Steiner, the Executive Director of UNEP, so we do hope that you can stay. Without taking any more time, I would like to hand you over to Marcelo Takaoka, who's the Chair of the Advisory Board for UNEP's Sustainable Building and Climate Initiative, as well as being Chairman of the Brazilian Sustainable Construction Council. Thank you, Marcelo.
On behalf of the United Nations Environmental Programme, Sustainable Building and Climate Initiative, UNEP SBCI, I welcome you all to this important discussion and debate. In addition to their fine publication, Climate Change Actions has done a fantastic job. I would also like to express UNEP SBCI's gratitude and appreciation for the important work that ICLEI and the Green Building Councils are doing. Now, I will show just a few numbers to demonstrate the importance of the construction sector for climate change and the green build and sustainable development. Today, cities consumptions about 73% of global energy, as Gino told it to me. Efficient urban spaces can reduce the energy use by a more efficient urban planning, which includes the daily needs of the families in walking distance. So if you integrate actions on buildings, infrastructure, and urban spaces, we can reduce more than 30% the energy use of the cities, reducing the gap to the 2 degrees target for climate change, and create a contrast between the old inefficient model of urbanism and the new sustainable model to stimulate families to demand new approach that can provide a better place to live and work for them. Finally, I would like to invite you to come to São Paulo next year for the UNEP SBCI annual meeting, when we will have a unique opportunity to include in the agenda of Rio+20 conference the role of buildings and urban spaces, taking in consideration that we live in a very urbanized world. Again, welcome you all to this important discussion and debate regarding the pressing issues and opportunities for climate change mitigation offered by cities and buildings. With this brief introduction and welcome, I now turn the event to Gino Van Begin, Deputy Secretary General of ICLEI.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcelo. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me and an honor to facilitate this esteemed panelists here that we have been able to set together at this podium. I would just like to start by introducing our panelists, and I will just go along the line here. First of all, we have Mr. Rodrigo Rosa, who is the advisor to the Deputy Mayor and Secretary of the Environment of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Welcome. We have then Romilly Meadew, who is the CEO of the Green Building Council in Australia. Welcome. Rodney Milford, Program Manager of Construction and Industry Development Board and co-chair of the UNEP SB Index Steering Committee. Then we have Mr. Silas Zimu, CEO of Suzlon Wind Energy South Africa. Then we have Mr. Karl Kleinhans, Country President of South Africa, from Schneider Electric. And finally, Ramon Cruz, Climate Policy Manager of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policies. So, ladies and gentlemen, this session is about the cities of the future. How will cities develop? And let me just say that from our perspective, from ICLEI, that I should also say that ICLEI is a local government association unifying more than 1,250 cities around the world, in particularly working on sustainability. And what we see in the last years, and in particular if we just think in the timelines of 20 years ago when the Rio Summit came together for the first time in 1992, and soon in Rio again next year, we have seen that cities are actually taking enormous amount of actions in terms of sustainability projects, in terms of sustainability planning, in terms of transformation of their cities. This is absolutely a necessity. If today we know that 3.5 billion people live in cities, we also do know that in the next 40 years, another 3.5 billion people will live on this planet, and most probably in cities. It means that cities and mayors will, in the next 40 years, face an enormous amount of stress in the sense of looking towards programs, looking towards projects, looking to their urban planning mechanisms to accommodate yet another 3.5 billion people in cities, to provide them with the appropriate access to sanitation, transportation, in terms of food and food supply, energy production. So mayors are looking towards the next 40 years in a very transformative way. And I think that is something that we would like to discuss here also. How is that working, and how, especially, how can we get us there, that, that these issues are going to be tackled? And can they be tackled actually only at the level of local governments, or should there not be a collaborative support mechanism that actually comes into place of current international governance mechanisms as we know them? So, from the outset, the idea is really, how are we going to accommodate another 3.5 billion people with the services that are requested in terms of quality of life for our citizens? So let me start in terms of the panel here. You have all been you are working with cities in a variety of fields. So what is your experience? What do you see happening on the ground in cities? What kind of progress has been made until now? And maybe I should just start first with our representative from Rio itself. You have in Rio, you have been doing enormous amount of work on, particularly on climate change, on getting climate change on the political agenda and implementing a number of projects. So maybe we should start with you. Go ahead. Rodrigo.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. You mentioned, Gino, that we are discussing about the future of cities, or what we think on the future. And I believe Rio de Janeiro has a special condition in this near future, because we have a promising calendar of events, of mega events, starting next year with the Rio +20. That will be discussing a little bit of the legacy that we had from Rio 92. We are here at COP because of what started in Rio 92. And I think we need to keep that spirit of Rio, as they used to say. And then we'll have the World Cup, and then
yes.
2014. South Africa just organized the World Cup. I was here a year ago, and actually watched the game here. And it was a wonderful World Cup, and we have a legacy now to move further. And also we will have the Olympics in the city. So it's a great opportunity to change, to reinvent the city. We have the benchmark, as the mayor likes to say, of Barcelona, that used the opportunity of the Olympics to change the whole planning and designing of the city. And I think in Rio we have to think like that also. We've been evolving a lot on the projects. It's an opportunity also in terms of investment. Just the Olympic program overall sums about 14 billion of investments in the city. And that it's an opportunity also to reinvent the public machine and the public administration. There is several challenges that the world is facing, including the climate change one, that we need localities, we need local governments to be adapted to address. And in terms of climate change, it's part of the Olympic project. We set targets on our global emissions, as many cities have been doing, unlike national government, that's some of them are still getting trouble into making decisions. But I think Rio Plus 20 itself will be a good opportunity for local governments to stand up, to show that they're taking actions. And I think we all here are in some way working on that. And in Rio, I'm not going to go through all our plan. I think other the panelists will have to talk. But in terms of climate change, we have set a target of reducing by 8% in 2012, and 16% in 2016. That's a little bit of course, we set the calendar with the Olympics itself, and by 20% on 2020. And all the projects that have been done in the city, we have, for example, we're investing a lot. 2/3 of this Olympic program, it's based basically on investment in public transportation. That's one of the things that we still lack in our city, and especially mass transportation. And we are building what we call the ring of 4 BRT lines in the city. And that is part of this Olympic program. And this will help also addressing climate change. We're now specifically on the discussions on what will be the energy source of this BRT, if it will be ethanol, hybrid, electric, all these technologies coming up. And I think this is the role of local governments. So we're buyers, we're public sector, we have to push, especially these sectors that still need some support from the government, and that's what we're planning to do for the Olympics in Rio.
Thank you. I think this is. I would like to take it immediately to Ramon as a specialist in transportation mobility. Ramon, I was 10 days ago in Istanbul, and I was told that in Istanbul they register new cars per 600 a day. Now, that is just a case of Istanbul. We also know that in China, the access to the cars, individual cars, is immense. So how are cities going, or what do you see in terms of transportation and mobility planning? How are cities taking up these challenges, in particularly of mirroring or limiting the individual cars as opposed to public transportation and advancing public transportation?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Gino. And I will focus first on the positive aspects. As we continue the debate, we'll address many of the problems that we're seeing in many of the cities. But transportation infrastructure plays a key role in providing access to jobs, markets, to improving the quality of life and of its citizens, and lifting people out of poverty. But in terms of transportation planning, the key is mixing land uses. It's increasing the densities in terms of housing, commercial activity, and then integrating transportation and mobility to these corridors of housing and commercial activities. And you have pioneer cities like Curitiba in Brazil that has been for decades addressing and planning along these principles. And they continue doing that with developments like the Linha Verde right now, where again they integrate housing and commercial activities. That it's the perfect the perfect combo for economic development. No, other cities like Bogota with the Transmilenio. A model for many other cities in terms of bus rapid transit and development of open space, of cycling, bicycle path, etc. And they're now even looking at things like congestion pricing. And then I would name Guangzhou, China, as a big model right now, where the bus rapid transit, the recent development of bus rapid transit, integrates the current infrastructure already of the metro system with bike share programs, with greenways along the river, etc., to promote again the same principles of sustainable living. So we're seeing positive examples along all over the world, actually. And I'll stop there, but I would like to go back.
Sure, we can do that.
Yeah.
I want to stay on your positive note and give the floor also to Carl, because Carl, you said to me that you also see quite some positive things happening in terms of smart cities, smart grid. That there are blocks that start to be built up. So do you agree that you can see that not only in the transportation sector but also in other sectors you have that positive feeling as well?
Sure, yes, absolutely. So firstly, thanks for having me on the panel. It's great to be
Welcome.
at the stadium because actually many of the energy management solutions and security and control systems here are Schneider Electric systems. So it's great to be having this panel discussion here today. Yes, I think what I've noted is that many of these building blocks are already very much in place. In fact, maybe even all of the building blocks are to a large degree already there. If I look at just Schneider's portfolio, we have solutions around smart grids, smart mobility, smart water, smart public services, homes, buildings, and so on. So all the blocks are in the right place. I think what's maybe missing is a little bit of collaboration in between the different companies and the different stakeholders within the smart city type of environment. I remember once upon a time I heard, I think it was the CEO of HP at the time, he said that if only HP knew what HP knew, they'd be a lot further than they were at that particular moment in time. And I think the same can be said around smart cities. I think if we all knew what we all knew, I think we'd be kicking this thing into a whole new gear and be able to move a lot faster forward. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of pockets of excellence, I think we can call them, and I think we need to all work together and collaborate and share those best practices.
Let's talk a little bit about energy efficiency in particular, and let's turn maybe to you. In terms of energy efficiency, what do you see happening in cities and progress that has been made?
Sure. So the World Green Building Council's been around for 10 years, and there's now 92 green building councils around the world. And if you think about the last decade, everything really focused on the individual building. So energy efficiency in the home, energy efficiency in the office, you know, the changing our building codes that focused on energy efficiency, and the rating tools that are around the world like Green Star, LEED and BREEAM were very much focused on just the individual building. And there's been a real shift in the last couple of years from buildings to communities and cities. And that's been the fantastic thing, I think, and what the discussion is about today is where that shift's going and what are the issues around that shift. And what you find now is there's a lot of cities that have shifted from that buildings focus. So you've got the New York City Plan. Singapore has done a lot of work on their city. Mexico City actually just won a World Green Building Council Leadership Award in policy. And you're finding that at a city's level, whether that's an individual local government or it's a national government that's focusing on the many local governments within a city, there is a big shift that's happened. And there's a lot of discussion now around what are the opportunities around cities? And I know we'll discuss that further today, but I think there's challenges to those opportunities, but the focus has really shifted from that individual building to how that building fits within a community and a city and where we go with that.
Rodney, you are working on green building rating tools, trying to integrate also the different sectors when it comes to the buildings. Could you just add on what Romilly was just saying?
I think much of the issues have already been raised here. The issue of integration, the issue of transformation, all the rest of it. But maybe a point I'd like to raise. I believe that much of the knowledge base already exists. Many of the solutions do exist. The challenge, as we were talking about earlier on, in fact, is one of upscaling it. How do we translate intent into action? We've seen a whole range of information being translated into codes, standards, rating systems, whether they be for individual buildings, whether they be for roads, as green roads as well. We've seen, as Ron mentioned, rating systems now for communities and that. But the challenge is, how do we upscale? How do we get it rolled out? How do we get more and more local authorities, communities, business to use them. To me, that is the challenge. The knowledge base exists, largely.
We'll talk about this in a minute, I think. Let us move to Silas, in particular wind energy, as one of those other sectors. So you as a CEO, what do you see? How is wind energy being taken up, particularly also here in the Global South?
Thank you again. Am I on?
I think you're on, yeah.
I would like to start by looking at what the problems are currently in the cities, especially in Africa.
Okay.
I think as Africans, we're doing very well in getting to the people and understanding what they need, and then come up with what we call the integrated development plan. But we lack on the service delivery of what the people want us to do. Now we're going to also have to say, are we dealing with these communities as customers, or are they consumers who may not have to pay, or are they constituencies who have voted us into power? That makes a big difference depending on one community to the other. But when you go to these communities or the politicians and you start talking smart city, smart grid, smart meter, you know, how are you interpreted? There's a belief that anything that is smart makes you lazy. And it may not come with the money that you want for the investment that is needed. But as has been said, I think the solutions are already there. The fact that the cities have got now agreements that they can learn from each other is very important. But we must see those learning points being shared more. For a country like Brazil, with its favelas being on smart meters, why can't the Johannesburg and other cities be on smart meters? And they've seen the revenue management improving drastically. In South Africa, we have huge problems with non-technical losses, and nobody's looking at the lessons from Brazil. So on the wind, I think it's important that the cities also look at the advantages that they have of the wind patterns in their cities. Because there's nothing stopping them from having wind farms of their own that can supply their communities instead of relying on Big Brother Eskom, who has already told us there's not enough supply. So why don't you create your own supply through wind? You've got that opportunity. You can play around with the tariff. We may argue that it still has to be regulated, but I personally believe it has to be deregulated on the basis that it's your own plant. You can do whatever you want with it. Then you start passing things like free basic electricity to your communities that are in so much need of electricity or energy, but without any employment.
Still, we are facing, nonetheless, a situation where it's not going as good in all cities. I mean, there are clearly our issues. The question is, where are we now 20 years after the Rio Summit? Have we made overall progress in terms of sustainable development or not? So I would just like to ask the panel here what are the issues? What is preventing us of scaling it up or progressing in such ways, as I said at the beginning, that we will actually be able not only to make our existing world better, but also to accommodate another 3.5 billion people to live in a similar way. So what are the issues that you feel are around here?
I think
Romilly, please.
I think there's probably there's a raft of issues, and I won't grab them all because I'm sure we all have them. But it's things like you need a plan, and many cities have a plan, but they don't have targets and they don't have measures. And you'll see that all these politicians come out and go, look, we've got a plan, great plan. Look, we've got a great plan, look at these, it's fantastic. But they then don't articulate what are the challenges and what is the metric they're going to use to fix the issues, whether it be a transport issue, an energy efficiency issue, waste, water. Every city has different challenges. And then there's no targets that they set and they're going to report on every year. So no one holds them to account. So the cities basically can, do the rhetoric, but then there's no accountability in how they're going to achieve it.
Rodney.
Can I just add one comment to that? I agree totally, targets, accountability, but what comes up front of it is leadership. And in many cases, the leadership has not been demonstrated, I believe.
But it's also an issue of capacity building. And definitely if we look into emerging economies and developing countries. So what I would think is one of the issues that is preventing to move on. Rodney's.
Look, capacity building is important, critically important. But capacity building, I believe, is very context specific. In a developed world, the function, the role, the need for capacity building may be different to some other developing countries, whatever the case may be. But the golden rule is one needs to know what capacity, what competence do we need, what standards do we want, and we need to get the people. Context specific. In some cases we may need to get new people, in some cases we may need to develop people. But capacity is a big constraint, but it's something we should be able to address. Set the standard, understand the competence, and develop the people. But we're just often not following through. In some developing countries, I expect also in developed countries, one of the challenges we have is we do build capacity, these large capacity building programs. But the officials, or whatever it is, very high turnover and rate of churn. So you build capacity, people go, build capacity, but the fundamental principles are there. We just need to do it properly and keep at it and sustain it.
Rodrigo, you in mega city, Rio de Janeiro, transformation, what barriers are you encountering in your daily work?
Yeah, one of the things that we find when we discuss about this, how do we move on with this green economy, and bringing on that we discussed on capacity building, we have to break the barrier of this type of conference, the people that are into it. And if you bring that subject to the decision makers that are speaking to the broad audience, they still don't get what we are talking to ourselves here. And how do we do that? Sometimes I think sometimes the focus is too much on the capital, the physical investment. We want to put all the technologies are expensive. We want to put all the money on like Vanguard to make it a better, let's say, competitive. But we lack on investment on awareness and education and how to form people. And it's not only like making those, it's not only like the Greenpeace and this public awareness that we see, but we need to get into the electors. And those are the ones that are going to pressure decision makers to make decisions towards green economy and development. And I think sometimes this type of investment depends a lot of engaging the population also. If you talk about transportation or waste, even construction, if you don't play with the people, the population, you're not going to manage with the plan, the city that's going to grow and function. So I think that the focus should go more about how to engage people and effectively with measurement and monitoring, etc.
So capacity building, awareness raising are issues that need to be addressed or that should be happening. Funding. All cities need funding. My understanding is that lots of the actions that have been undertaken, in particular climate actions, are actually funded by the local budgets, 90% of them. So here at the COPs, there are negotiations about the Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund. In your opinion, are these international mechanisms, are these mechanisms that can help to effectively make progress in cities? Carl?
Yeah, no, not so much on that point. More going back a little bit on the fact that there's many stakeholders, and I couldn't agree with what you were saying more. And I agree with you as well. We need leadership, but I don't think there is a single leadership that's standing out. I think we need leadership from the private sector. We need leadership from government. We need leadership from investors, from developers, from utilities. I really think it's about collaboration. Sorry, I'm going back a little bit on the previous point.
Sila. I give just the floor to Silas.
Gino, I think the issue on leadership and human capital capacity has been addressed, but we should not forget that we are continually bragging as countries of how many people we have taken through universities that have qualified, but we still cannot create opportunities for them. If one looks at the notion of the cities that are having agreements at the moment, why should we be piloting something that is working in Brazil instead of bringing it as is from Brazil if it's working in Brazil? Otherwise, why should Brazil come here and tell us that it's working if we don't believe them? And then that will minimize things such as measurements and verifications that take months when we are in a crisis. Okay? Most of the cities, if you look at their annual reports, year-end, they've not spent all their money. Who's going to give them money when they can't spend their own money? That's a big challenge. Now, the issue of, are we really helping each other or are we competing with each other? Those cities that are doing well, why don't they just pass on their experience to other cities and help them to be where they are, instead of wanting to be seen as the best cities, the best cities? Otherwise, why have we got these agreements of cities?
Still, I want to bring it back to the issue of funding. So it's something which is, in all these negotiations, in particularly highly on the agenda. In particular here in Durban, negotiations are about funding, and there are serious issues about that. So,
I think, yeah, that definitely it's very key. If I bring it back to transportation, for example, that actually was not very well addressed in the previous, didn't give sufficient attention in the Kyoto Protocol and Clean Development Mechanism. We hope that the Green Climate Fund could really shift that, in terms of making funding available to cities for mitigation in this aspect. Right now is the fastest, in the future will be the fastest growing share of greenhouse gases will be in the transport sector. And, you take mega cities, and bringing it back to what you mentioned of the, as the world welcomed the 7th billionth inhabitant, Danica Camacho in Manila, you have Manila typifies what's wrong with many aspects in terms of planning and transportation. It's streets choked with cars everywhere, making it unsafe, difficult to breathe, etc. And the problem is often, what you mentioned in like Istanbul, motorization increase, rates, that increase. And the problem then, in emerging economies like China, India, is that the purchasing power of the middle class, it's increasing. So the first thing is, let's get a car. And short-term politics, will give them probably a highway to try to go fast. But things like the Green Climate Fund would actually be a trigger to lead the path towards a low sustainable transport. So, a developing country can think about building a bus rapid transit instead of a highway. So I think those are things that we have to align those incentives and put international pressure into domestic funding that actually is, of course, much more than what the Green Climate Fund could be about, but again, could lead us in the right way.
Rodney? Sorry?
Yeah. If I could make 3 points, the one is off the point, but the last comment that you made I think is very important. First of all, the Green Climate Fund, I think we mustn't be under the impression that this is a fund which is going, if it does go ahead, in which basically it's not grant funding, it is loan funding. So it is not necessarily going, everyone can access this fund. It's going to be loan funding. It may be lower interest rates or whatever it is, but it's not grant. A small part is grant. But I think the last point that you made is the critical point. Yes, funding is important, but countries need to look at their own domestic sources of funding as well. Not everything requires huge funding. Let's use our current resources wisely. Yes, we need to leverage. Yes, we need to tap into other sources of funding, but use our own resources wisely as well. We can't sit back and do nothing if we don't get extra, FDI or foreign funding. We can't do that. I want to just digress slightly, and Ram wants to make a comment on this one, but also, yes, transportation is a critical issue, and we've heard this, and maybe we can get back to it later. Transportation is an important issue in terms of cities and climate, but so is buildings, so is roads, so is energy. And it's this integration and cross-sectoral issue that really has to come out. It's not just transportation or buildings or energy. It's the integration, the cross-sectoral. The funding issue is important. Maybe, I don't know if you want to make a comment on the funding.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a point that Ramon made, was that you were talking about, the international negotiations. And one of the things that has been missed in the international negotiations is the Clean Development Mechanism missed buildings. So it missed the things that you could actually make an impact on the ground, and it focused on other areas. And there are some building projects that came through CDM, but the proportion, and I know UNEP has done some work on this, the proportion of buildings that got CDM funding was so low. So low, but if you think about it, we all live, work and play in buildings. Cities are buildings, they're a bunch of buildings. So the funding mechanisms, we need to, and you use the words, we need to shift what these negotiations are doing and actually focus on what our cities can do. When it comes to individual countries and cities, what they're looking at in Australia, and I promised, yes, I know I'm from the World Green Building Council today, I'm representing Jane, but I'll just give one Australian example, is they're looking at conditional funding on cities. So they're saying to cities under a national program with all capital cities in Australia, you have to meet these 9 principles that talk about integration, governance, climate change and a whole lot of different things. If you want government funding from the national government. So they're actually forcing that link to get change, because otherwise the cities will sit back and go, well, why do we need to do anything? Why do we need to do anything?
Yeah, I'd like to add up a little bit on this. I think we have to burn our heads, burn our minds on, especially the economists and people in the financial sector. They still have to build instruments to make this flowing of resources. In Brazil, we still, like, I don't know what is the reality of specifically in your countries, but I know what we're facing. Sometimes we do have a lot of resources and revenues, but we don't have the capacity of building projects that are adapted to those resources. And still that goes for regular funding. If you talk about carbon funding or green funding, there is a little externality on the price, or that even the financial government institutions, they still don't have the mindset to build this type of funding. So it goes back on the capacity building. How do we capacitate local governments to get this money, and how do we capacitate financial institutions to push forward on this? In Brazil, the bank that is has moved forward on green funding, it's the government bank. It's not the private banks. They're much better than the government bank in all other areas of financing, but not on the green funding. So,
yes, Silas.
Yeah. Gino, I think the advantage of having COP17, and hopefully there won't be COP100, is the fact that many cities that don't know what to do, meaning lack of planning, not of people to plan, but lack of knowing what to do, are piggybacking on the few that know what to do with that money. So that money is going to sit there. Not many cities are going to be able to match the condition. And I think before the money is even announced, cities must sit down and say, how are we going to get green? And that planning is what will then determine whether, I'm not even worried whether the money is needed or not. I'm worried as to, by the time all cities are able to know what they need to be done, that money may not be enough. It's based on the few that know what they want to do, and the rest of us are just following.
Thank you. Let us nonetheless talk a little bit about solutions now. And we know that we are now here at the COP17. This is very much about climate change. But in 6 months' time, the world comes together in Rio to look into what has been achieved over the last 20 years. How are we going to move on? What needs to be done further? So if we could just, building from what you just said, look into the perspectives. Again, what are the solutions in terms of governance? What are in terms of international governance? What are the solutions in terms of our economies? The word is being spread that we should go for green economy. How would that look like? So I'd like to get the panel's views on this. And let me start with you, Rodrigo, because you are from Rio. So maybe you can inspire from Rio all the the nations when they come to Rio.
First of all, I would like to invite you all to come to Rio on June next year. I think one of the things that we expect, not only evaluating what we moved from these 20 years, but also we have to keep this going. This part of the job, as we discussed here. But I think sometimes we tend to see a lot of criticism because things don't move the way we would like to. We're always going for the perfect, and that never exists. I think there is some legacy behind. In '92 was the first time we brought up the concept of sustainable development. Now everybody talks about it, but nobody knows exactly what it is. You know, I have a friend that likes to say that it was like sex on this old primary school. Everybody says what it is, but nobody knows exactly what it is. So nowadays things have changed a little bit also. But anyway, I think we're moving forward. We still need to find this financing right. Of course, it's all about pricing, the carbon pricing externalities that are making the environment suffer. That the market, it's still a market failure, and we're learning how to do it. And that goes for local government, that goes for national governments and companies and everything.
Romilly.
I think really, and some countries have done this well, and cities, is you really need strategic policy interventions. And one of them, and Rodney and I were talking about this before, but I'm grabbing this one, is about the integration of our departments. So you think you've got the Department of Planning, Department of Environment, Department of Infrastructure, and Department of Transport. They don't talk to each other. I don't know about your cities, but I know many cities I talk to. And so, yeah, exactly. And, you know, just at a basic level, one of the major solutions is just an integration of planning and ensuring that when our cities are being planned, and, you know, this includes adaptation, mitigation, building it back green when there's been a severe weather event. I think nearly every city will talk about bushfires, floods, cyclones, hurricanes. We've all experienced these terrible climate change, extreme weather events. But it's about making sure that our departments talk to each other. Because you find that they'll go, we're going to put 30,000 people out there, but we've forgotten to build a railway, and we forgot to put the school in, but there's a stack of homes out there. And so really, I think one of the major solutions is coming back to the discussion around case studies, is finding those cities that have done it really well on integrated planning and showcasing them at events like this so we can all learn from how to do it, because they're not doing it well in Australia.
Rodney.
Yeah, just a comment to add on to the issue of policy, and I agree fully, the whole issue of policy integration is critical, but so is policy coherence and policy consistency. And very often what one has seen is that one policy conflicts with another policy. You may be driving green objectives, but that is not consistent with your economic objectives. So policy coherence is very important. Business is always looking for policy consistency. They want to know what business or the environment is going to be like next year, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. But another nuance around policy, what is needed to go forward, what are the solutions and the rest of it. We need a range of policy instruments. You know, I firmly believe that national governments need to set a national policy, national objectives, national direction. But national governments also need to create the space for an enabling environment for business, for local government to respond in. That's where the real dynamics occurs. But I believe it has to occur within a national environment. The issue of national policy and even local policy that supports or drives or encourages industry or cities, whatever the case may be, depends very much on the context again. This comment that was made at a forum yesterday, where business is leading, government can follow. The key issue is when no one is leading, what do we do? And their governments, specifically national, have to step in, but create that space for cities to respond. That's where the real action is. And the business sector, that's where the real action is.
Thank you. Silas?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat the integration part because I think it's very important. You know, it's not only giving problems to those units or departments, but imagine the roads guys coming to your roads, open the road and close it nicely. The water guys come tomorrow, open it, close it badly. The electricity guys come a day after. demolish the road. You become irritated as a customer. But I think we must also learn to bring more of education. We're talking about these things as if everybody understands them like we do. If you look at the National Geography on TV, so many people get glued on it. And, it's things that we may not know the detail of what whales and sharks do in the sea, but why don't you have such programs on energy, or on smart grids, on smart cities, so that people can then get the interest? I think that's for me, it's the lack of customer education is very key. But we also need to look at the issue of tenders. In my 10 years at Eskom, I've chaired the tender committee for 8 years. I've chaired the tender committee in the city of Joburg for 10 years. Most of the time, it's price and the quality get compromised. The evaluators don't understand what the end product is needed. They're looking at the cheaper ones. Things don't last out there, and then everybody gets blamed. So we need to find a new way of saying, how are we going to allow those good products to be the ones that we use?
Green procurement, actually. Greening our procurement.
Redefining.
So, and this is an issue, particularly also in Europe, where ICLEI has been working on very much so with the European Commission, because we felt that in particular cities in their tendering procedures were prevented of actually choosing or selecting green products, green services, because they may be a little bit more expensive. And we have been working very closely with the European Commission to find ways, nonetheless, as to how you may identify and design your tender and conduct your tender procedures, so that both between environment and what we have, our competition, internal market rules, that we are not contradicting them. So a lot of work has been done there, at least in Europe, and I think we have to proliferate this and get it to other cities as well. Carl, please.
Yeah, I think
solutions.
As it comes down to me, I think all I can do is really enforce the message, because I think it's pretty clear that it's about business collaboration, it's around people ownership, public governance, and again, I think it just goes back to collaborating early, from an international, from local levels.
But how do we do it, Carl? How can we be collaborative? Certainly, everybody around this panel here, and I guess in the audience, is not against collaborative support and collaborative, working conditions. But how do we do it really? I mean, how do we get really, in a systematic way, the private sector talking with the governmental sector? How do we do that?
But this is where green building councils come in, because most green building councils are actually private and public. You'll find that the majority of them, and so it gives you then an opportunity to get the private and public together, because half our building stock is owned by government. So it's a place where you actually can have that dialogue. So in Australia, there's the government has set up a national urban policy, and I'm sitting on it, but so is the head of the Property Council. So the government have, mind you, we've been lobbying for a year, but the government have seen that it's crucially important that it's mostly the private sector who are paying for the buildings, managing the buildings, developing the buildings, and they need to have them in the tent. So there's a lot to go in that.
I want to give the floor back to Carl to continue, particularly in terms from the private sector. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one to answer. I mean, yeah, we need to create forums where business and government can sit together in the same room and discuss and debate. And I don't know, necessarily what the best formats and the formulas are. You got some ideas?
No, but just a comment. I agree with you. Business and government need to collaborate, but so does business and business need to collaborate, and so does government and government need to collaborate. It's a whole. It's like transport and buildings need to collaborate. And again, I don't know, just maybe the route that I've come from, whatever it is, it's a case of policy coherence. You have to be consistent messages, incentives, environment to be able to collaborate, to encourage collaboration. And so, yes, we have to talk. Yes, we need forums. But we need the drivers, the business drivers, the policy drivers that encourage it.
Mm-hmm. Ramon, I would like to give the floor first to Ramon. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, in terms of transport, since that's my area, right? But, I wanted to make reference to a series of principles that we use when we often work as technical advisors to city governments. And we work under 8 principles. I would like to list them now. It's first is walk, develop neighborhoods that promote walking. cycle, prioritize cycling networks, connect, create dense networks of streets and paths, transport, support high quality public transport, mix for mixed use land use planning, densify, match density and transit capacity, compact, create compact regions and short commutes, and shift, increase the mobility and regulate by regulating parking and road use. So these are, again, like a mix of policies and incentives that are part of what we call the push and pull strategies. No, it's not enough to promote public transport. Of course, everybody is, for mass transit, but we often see that when a city focuses on that, then people start using mass transit. Then that creates room in the road for people further down to come by cars. So then in that way, we often end up with an increasing greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector because people have to, go from further distances. So at least if you promote those, for example, push strategies that take people out of cars, like congestion pricing, parking incentives, license restrictions, together with pull strategies, that is investments in making transport safer, more efficient, more faster. So that is the kind of approach that cities need to use when developing, when thinking of sustainability and how to build towards the future. And in terms of collaboration, I just wanted to mention a model, even though I'm not from the private sector, but we have often, in terms of transport, used creative ways like public-private partnerships that are great models, are not to be used everywhere, right? But in certain cases, it's a great combination of the public sphere with the efficiencies from the private sector.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. So I would like to give it back to the panel here. Questions about direct access or easing the access to international funding mechanisms, such as, for example, the Green Climate Fund. The issue of collecting data at a local level and how can that be done best ways. Comments with regard to leadership and cities being on the front as front runners acting. Panel, please do come in. Who wants to take the floor first? Rodney.
Can I just maybe make a comment, and then I'd also like to come back in a later question on the issue of how do we get access to the funding. I think the point that I tried to raise there, with regard to the Green Climate Fund, we're going to have to wait and see that it has not been established yet. So how to get access to the Green Climate Fund still has to evolve. But just to repeat what I said earlier on, indications are there's not going to be a significant amount of grant funding coming from it. And I think we should not expect to see huge sums of money that we can get access to. It's going to be loan funding. That's the early indications. But let's wait to see what happens. But there are a whole range of other possible funding mechanisms, as I try to say, including using one's own. But Ron mentioned, CDMs hasn't been attractive to buildings, but we are hoping that the NAMAs will be attractive to buildings. So there are potentially other ones we need to see as they are released. What are the opportunities? At the moment, the opportunities is not clear. And we have to, I believe, use our existing funding wisely. I don't believe we should say we cannot move forward because we don't have money. Climate change is upon us, and we need to deliver services. We have to move forward.
I believe cities have understood that. I think really they have a personal interest since most of these projects and that support the transformation of the city are actually funded by the local budgets. It's in the city's interest to look in that this is wise and effectively, of course, spent. Yeah. Please, Roman.
Well, yeah, in terms of a couple of issues, no? But in terms of access of funding, I applaud ICLEI's effort in these forums to bring mayors to get to know about this, because at least when I mentioned, the lack of attention in the Kyoto Protocol or CDM, to issues of transportation, a lot has to do with you know, a lack of communication between cities, regions, national governments, and also within ministries of transport that deals with domestic budgets, and ministries of foreign affairs, and that are often the ones here, or ministries of environment. So in terms of funding, I think NAMAs, for example, will be key, you know? And there's a lot of, you know, flexibility, I guess, right now, or lack of clarity in terms of what specifically NAMAs will be. But I think it's, at least when we work with governments and cities, we promote that they go and talk to their national policies and include everything they can. You know, in terms of that, we see NAMAs as a menu of options, that it's important that cities contribute to them and add to that menu, so that regardless of what happens to the Green Climate Fund, comes developed a donor country with money for bilateral agreements, and they will probably look at that menu of options in terms of what to fund in the future. So I think the work of cities are key. In terms of data, I think you know, the best examples will probably, you know, China will be one of them. No, with it's amazing the amount of data that they collect. No, but I think the challenge is not so much who's doing great, because of course not everybody is China, but it's how we can work with governments that have not been you know, collecting all this data in the past. And in ITDP's case, we're working with developing models to quantify emissions from the transport sector. In the past, there was not that much data. You know, so then developing countries cannot access those funds because they cannot establish good baselines. So for us, it's important to work with models that are accessible and that work with a series of assumptions and defaults to then start establishing this baseline, start accessing these funds, and start monitoring, reporting, and verifying into the future these projects. So I think those, well, I'll stop there.
Rodney, and then Silas. Rodney?
If I can maybe respond to 2 points, try and very briefly. The issue of data as well. There is a lot of reporting mechanisms which have been established nowadays. ICLEI has got a reporting protocol which is used by many cities. That data is available. The Carbon Disclosure Project has just released a report based on the C40 cities around the world, and there's some excellent information inside those. UNEP SPCI is developing mechanisms for buildings, whatever the case may be. So we are doing more and more. I think the argument is we need to get more and more measurement in places and reporting mechanisms in places. But I'd just like to touch on this issue of leadership. And while I agree and while I commented that leadership is fundamental, there's a very interesting report undertaken by UNEP SPCI. Yes, it was specific to the building industry, but I expect it would be specific to many other industries as well. But it did a review of the policy instruments in, I don't know, something like 20, 30 countries to see which was the most effective way climate change has been driven. And it turned out that the most effective way and most efficient way that it has been driven is through legislation. But very often in combination with other policy instruments such as financial mechanisms, capacity building, whatever the case may be. But what really came out of that is one needs a combination of policy instruments. Yes, leadership is fundamental, but leadership is not going to turn it into the answer. One needs a whole lot of incentives, policy instruments underneath it.
And it was found when the World Green Building Council did a leadership awards on cities policy, it found that it was those cities that had set mandatory disclosure requirements. So you had to mandatory disclose your energy efficiency, were the ones that also had a target. And so they would say whether it's 9% by 2015, savings in energy efficiency. And you need the data to be able to track how you're going with that. So some countries are quite sophisticated in how they collect data, but data is so complicated because every country is different in how they define it. You know, what's the source of what's the source of energy, whether it's hydro, coal, or whatever. It gets quite complicated. I think you've picked up on a really big issue that everyone struggles with, is data collection and how we can get a global definition of that. But it's interesting. I think there are a number of cities that have very good building codes. Singapore is a great example of that, and it's that mixture of building code and which is regulatory, and a voluntary rating system. Yeah. And Singapore is a great example of that.
Thank you. Silas?
Yeah, what I wanted to point out is, municipalities, cities are governed by the Municipal Finance Management Act. There's things that they can't do. Okay? I think my advice when it comes to funding, how do you access that funding, is the National Treasury has to put set-asides on how local governments with good plans can access that money without going through national government, but have a protocol of how do you report back as well as to how you've used that money. That will include a public-private partnership, which is taking so long as per the Act. It needs to be reduced, the timing of it, because it's just taking away the opportunities. So special delegation of authorities need to be given to the city managers, the mayors, included into those Municipal Finance Management Act. Then it will become easy, because you're going to be audited through what you didn't comply with on the Act, not a good project that you would have done. On the issue of data, there's no one who's got enough data like the cities. But that data is sitting in centralized machines that needs to be, in decentralized machine that needs to be put through a middleware of some sort. Or you can use the automated metering infrastructure, not the meters themselves, but the IT side of the automation, to say, let all of those things be coordinated in one. The GIS, South Africa is so good in it. So much information is sitting there. So then start talking to the cell phone companies who are doing so well in that. No one is not getting his bill for cell phones, and no one is not getting switched off when they've not paid. So some things they're doing right on the data. That includes the post offices and the banks. Talk to them, but it cannot happen up until everyone agrees on a common information model. Otherwise, you're going to get a mess. I mean, in IT, Silas Zimu is different from Zimu Silas. And it may be seen as two people. So that common information model is very important that we agree on, and then we work from there.
Thank you. Anybody else from the panel would like to comment?
So I suppose we're kind of agreeing on almost like an open source on energy data as such, right? But I'd like to go a little bit back to one of the base building blocks we were talking about, well, many times through this evening, and that's the building, and perhaps a little bit back to self-funding. And again, I'm going to go back to an example that I know personally at Schneider. If I look at our headquarters just outside of Paris, we consolidated a number of our old premises into that single site, and we deployed a number of our own solutions, and we managed to divide our total consumption by 4 times. So we divided it by 4. And of course that has a return on investment, so it's becomes self-funding between 5 and 7 years. And this is the thing that's often missing. It's just by deploying the right kind of solutions, buildings, which are the building block to cities, you can really show, you can reduce your consumption and your expenditure down by 4 times. And there's a lot of funding, and I suppose, and that's when the financing comes in, because you've got to bridge that 5 to 7 years. And I think that's where the financing mechanisms maybe play an important role. Okay. Maybe it's a bit too micro, I don't know, but if we start there.
Rodney?
Yeah, very briefly, one needs to differentiate, I believe, between benchmarking at an individual element versus target setting at a city level. They're 2 totally different things. I'm not sure that we need national agreements on on data standards or whatever it is, and I'm not sure that we need massive, complicated systems. What we do need is consistency in reporting. We don't necessarily have to compare city to city, but if a city is setting targets, as Ron was saying, we need targets. You need to measure against those targets on a consistent basis. We're not going to get the perfect answers. It is hugely difficult. I've written a report on greenhouse gas emissions from buildings in South Africa. We don't have the data available in South Africa for that. But you can make assumptions, and we need to be consistent, and we need to improve. Consistency is the issue.
Thank you.
Just briefly on the issue of leadership, that sometimes, I agree that leadership is fundamental. I think many of the reforms that we pass, need a political champion, need consensus and somebody that will push that forward. However, often it's done in a bulldozing way, and I think then I would argue, I mean, or maybe it's just a thought, you know, for discussion, but more important than leadership is often, you know, an engaged citizenship. And so we need less leaders sometimes and more citizens. And for that is key the issue of education, no? And bring, you know, when you're going to bring things forward instead of acting as a bulldozer, it's more important to engage communities early on. When we think of, you know, the more advanced, you know, countries often, that people often would say, well, Scandinavia is you know, would be somewhere out there. And often, I mean, with all due respect, but you think of Scandinavian leaders, and many people outside Scandinavia cannot name them. But that's often because, you know, more than the leaders, the citizenship is engaged, and that's also as important.
And what's changed is technology in those countries that can use social media. So in Melbourne, they used, when Melbourne City put out a plan about something, they used social media to get the citizens engaged. So citizens tweeted, Facebooked, and basically responded. Because, you know, in the old days, we'd all go into the community hall and do some form of engagement. We're all too busy now. But a lot of people use social media, and Melbourne were overwhelmed at how many people engaged and the feedback they got. And the citizens felt engaged.
Thank you. Rodrigo.
Well, I'd just like to comment a little bit on what we said. I think we'll all see the same way. The challenge is comparability, and I think when you talk about funding or monitoring, funding depends on monitoring, because that's how you measure and compare. And tenders, we talk about tenders. How do we get the regulation right in terms of to select the best technology or the best green investment? And we're still working on as you said, there is a lot of initiatives going on. ICLEI has a report, CDP, we are part of the CDP. We've been working with the World Bank on a program called the Citywide Program, a citywide approach that has more a broader perspective to generate carbon credits instead of focusing on specific projects. But we're still, this is a pioneer initiative. We're still working on with the World Bank on building this institution. And we're moving forward, but I think we're still behind on having a easier manageable set of standards that we should have to move the green investment.
Thank you.